and welcome to Macros with Mythili, the ET Now show that takes a hard look at all the major macroeconomic issues and developments in India and overseas. This week we're going to take a hard look at the government's recent announcement of a committee to review the FRBM, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. This follows the FM's announcement in the budget speech, where he spoke of the need for a fresh look at the act that was passed in 2003 to examine whether it's in consonance with the recent times. More importantly, whether it ties the government's hands by reducing the degrees of flexibility available to it in times of economic slowdowns. And to discuss this, I have with me two of the best brains on the subject: Govinda Rao, former director, NIPFP, the Delhi-based fiscal think tank, and member of the 14th Finance Commission, and TTR Mohan, Professor, IIM Ahmedabad. Welcome to the show, Govind and TTR. Given how many times the fiscal deficit target has been paused or breached in the past decade, and how many roadmaps have been drawn up by various finance commissions and the Kelkar committee as well, does the appointment of a team to look at the FRBM Act serve any purpose at all, or is it once again a case of when in doubt, appoint a committee? It helps buy time, gives jobs to various retired bureaucrats, though in this case, of course, only 2 of the 5 members are retired bureaucrats. And one can always hope to bury the report if you don't like it. Govind, let me start with you first.
Well, I think it's a good idea to have to review the entire Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act and the process after 12 years of its operation. There has been a complaint that the fiscal targets that are set are not counter-cyclical, and there have been discussions on how to make them counter-cyclical. Now the problem is, in fact, you see, even the Finance Commission, the 14th Finance Commission was confronted this issue. But then the Commission at that time decided that, the best thing is to have a structurally adjusted deficits in place. But then, in the governmental system, you complicate more, you create more confusion. And then if you start giving a range rather than a pointed estimate, then the governments will always take the lower estimate and whichever is convenient.
Absolutely. Govind, we'll come to the details a little later, but my first question really was to put the entire debate in perspective by asking you that how often do we go on looking and relooking and yet again relooking? So let me just toss that question over to TTR and ask him, TTR, is there a case, how many times will you go on looking in the same situation? We all know what the answers are, and even assuming that there is a case for a fresh look at the FRBM target, are flexible targets really an oxymoron? Because what is the point of having rules if you're going to violate them again and again, and each time the rule is not convenient to you, you say, okay, we need a flexible target and look at it in terms of, whatever is convenient to you. TTR?
Yeah, good questions. Good questions, Mythili. I think the case for revisiting arises from the fact that many of the lacunae in the present targets or shortcomings have not been addressed by the earlier committees or commissions or whoever. I mean, first of all, if you have an FRBM target which is to have been met by 2009 and it's now proposed to be met in 2018, that is after something like 9 or 10 years after the deadline is passed, I mean, that itself should tell you that there's something unrealistic about the target, a target that cannot be met for something like 10 years past the deadline. The second thing is, I agree with Professor Govinda Rao that intuitively the idea of having a range makes more sense than having a single number, because it accords better with the concept of cyclically adjusted deficits. So when you have a downturn, it makes more sense to have a higher deficit target. When you have an upturn, it makes sense to have a lower deficit target. So setting a range, I think, has a certain intuitive appeal. The third point I would make is that the present measurement of the fiscal deficit target doesn't distinguish between fiscal deficits that are used to finance consumption expenditure and fiscal deficits that are used to finance capital expenditure. So I think it would be sensible to have or to define the deficit in a way which permits this distinction to be made. So you can have a lower deficit for pure consumption expenditure and have a certain allowance over that for capital expenditure, in which case you may be able to set a deficit target which is higher than the present target of 3%. And that sort of makes sense in an environment in which private investment is not picking up at all, is unlikely to pick up for the next couple of years until the NPA issues are resolved, and therefore, public investment needs to go back to the level of 2% of GDP, which it was in 2010-11. Ever since, it has been stuck in the range of 1.6 to 1.8%. So redefining the fiscal deficit target may of great help. The last point I would make is that the present FRBM targets were set before the 14th Finance Pay Commission's recommendations for a much higher order of transfers from the center to the states. So I think the question needs to be asked whether in light of the higher transfers, the same deficit targets are applicable to the center at all. We can have a consolidated view on the deficit, say 6% in total, but within that there is perhaps scope for a higher limit now for the center than for the states. So I think many of these issues need to be revisited in light of some of the changes that have happened or some of the compulsions that we face at the present moment.
Okay. Cohens TTR made a number of points. He said there is a case for a flexible target, a range. At the same time, he said that there is, we need to look at what is a reasonable fiscal deficit. How should we define the fiscal deficit to begin with? Should you have a separate fiscal deficit in terms of, what you're going to use for consumption, what you're going to use for capital expenditure? The one would have argued that a fiscal deficit that goes towards consumption is not really a fiscal deficit that is justifiable. So the entire question is, how does one define fiscal deficit? Should one look at it at the center alone or the center and the states? Ideally, it should be a combined fiscal deficit. And the 14th Finance Commission under Dr. Y.V. Reddy had recommended a 3% fiscal deficit for center and another 3% for the states, giving a combined deficit of 6% for the year 2015-16 to 19-20. But then you also have the issue of how do one apportion the deficit between states, because you have states which are widely diverse levels of development. So are they not all these issues? So my question to you is twofold really. How does one define fiscal deficit and how does one apportion it between the different states, Govind?
Well, I have a number of disagreements with Professor Ram Mohan to begin with. Now, let me put it this way. If the government, if there is a political willingness to be austere, there is no need for a deficit target. And if you do not have a political willingness, even if you have a target, you will violate it. The fact that they have been repeatedly violating doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that there is anything wrong with the targets as such. It's basically something wrong with the way in which our politics works. In 2008-9, when they did the loan waiver, pay commission recommendation, and the expansion of the National Rural Employment Guarantees Act, they completely violated the fiscal discipline part. This is one part of it. As far as the definition is concerned, if you really remember, we are not talking about 3% at all. In fact, when the 12th Finance Commission set up the target, they looked at the household sector's financial savings, and household sector's financial savings was of the order of somewhere about 10% at that time, and they said that 6% would be the appropriate thing for both union and the states. Today, the household sector financial savings is 7.3%, 7.4%. No, in that particular sense of the term, whatever you do, there is a supply constraint. And apart from the fact that there is a NPS in the banks, there is no money available unless and until you bring in the central bank of the country starts monetizing the deficit, which they said they will not do after 1997.
Very rightly so.
Okay, now that was an agreement between the Reserve Bank of India and the Ministry of Finance. But anyway. Now, as far as the total deficit is concerned, it's not 6%, even the Finance Commission's thing, it is 5.4% because 3% at the state, 3% of GSDP at the state level works out to 2.4% of GDP. Okay. So it's not 3 plus 3, it is 3 plus 2.4. Okay. The second thing, the issue of more higher transfers to the states doesn't come at all. You see, the Finance Commission has given a higher tax devolution, but the planned grants have been cut so much that if you see in 2014-15, the total transfers from the union to the states is something like 57% of the gross taxes of the center. Okay. 56% of the gross, 54.5% of the gross tax revenue of the center. In 2016-17, the budgeted, and the 2015-16 revised estimate works out to about 56.4. Now we are talking about a very, very marginal increase, and because when the Finance Commission tax devolution has increased, the planned grants are gone away. In fact, there is much more to it. It's not such a simple arithmetic as this thing. Total transfers have not increased. Let me put it very, very bluntly. So what the union government has given in one hand, it has taken away in another. I mean, not that the Finance Commission asked for an increase in total transfers. That's a different thing. And finally, on the definition side, when the 12th Finance Commission made this recommendation, it said that you need to phase out the fiscal deficit. You have the fiscal deficit to 6% by 2016-17. I'm sorry, 2008-9, and then the revenue deficit should be taken out. In fact, it should be the revenue deficit is a measure of the fiscal deficit for current consumption. So obviously, if you phase out that, it's a different thing that the union government doesn't want to do it. And in fact, the fact of the matter is that there is nothing wrong with that, but then usually the structurally adjusted deficit is the one which should be used. But if you use the range, there is always a problem, because the union government, the governments of the day, whichever is the party in power, will take the more convenient route. That's all.
Absolutely. Very right you are, Govind, in that. But I think on this note, we'll have to slip into a very short break. We'll discuss the issue of whether it's politics which is at the base of the problem, but that we'll do after the break. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the latest committee set up by the government to look at the FRBM Act, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, whether in the Indian context it serves any purpose at all, because we've had numerous blueprints in the past. TTR, before the break, Govind was saying that in fact our politicians, if they really did their job, maybe you didn't need rules at all, and that really is the crux of the problem. FRBM rules, if you look at them, are really neither necessary nor sufficient to ensure good behavior by the governments. Fudges are always possible, as we saw not only with the previous UPA government, but with successive governments. Under the previous UPA government, fudging perhaps reached a new high. But even in advanced countries like Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, and more recently Greece, it has really not served any purpose. In India, the Act succeeded perhaps in disciplining the states, because the states could not borrow without the permission of the centre. But it's really failed to discipline the centre. So how do we get them to behave? Initially, the centre's deficit declined from about 3.9% of GDP in 04-05 to 3.1 in 7-8. But then subsequently in 08-09, it shot up to 6%. In fact, if you look at the unpaid subsidy bills, it grows even higher to 8%. And this was initially justified on the grounds that it was necessary to counter the impact of the global financial crisis. But it was not reversed in time, and the FRBM targets were just suspended. So how does one really make the centre toe the line? In the states, it is possible. But how do you really hold the centre accountable? TTR?
Well, Mythili, I think nobody would dispute the need for rules of some sort in relation to the fiscal deficit. What we are debating now is, should we be hung up about this particular targets that we've had for a long time, which is, say, a target of 3% of fiscal deficit to GDP for the centre. And I think you need.
But what if the rules are just disregarded, TTR? What if the rules are just disregarded?
Yes, that may well be, contrary to what Professor Govinda Rao is saying, that may well be, because this particular target that we have arrived at may not be appropriate for the Indian situation. And let me elaborate on that. First, let me address the general issue of why we need a fiscal deficit target at all.
Okay.
I think there are two reasons why fiscal deficit target may be needed, and I think the economic survey of 2015-16 mentions both these reasons. The first is that you need to have a sustainable path for the debt to GDP ratio. So you need to understand that the fiscal deficit target is in fact a means to an end, and what we are really focusing on is what is an acceptable level of public debt for a given economy. Now, if you look at the Indian record for the past several years, in all these years we are straight from the FRBM target. At the same time, the debt to GDP ratio has either come down over several years, or in recent years it has remained reasonably stable at about 67% of GDP. Now, 67% of GDP may look a little high in relation to some of our emerging market peers, but it looks very healthy in relation to the debt levels in some of the advanced economies. But the point is that debt sustainability has not been endangered by our straying from the FRBM target, and there's a very basic reason for that. As you know, the two basic drivers of debt sustainability are the primary deficit to GDP ratio and the differential between the real interest rate and the real growth rate, or the nominal interest rate and the nominal growth rate. Now, in the case of India, both these factors have been extremely favorable over the last several years. The primary deficit to GDP ratio has come down, and the growth rate remains higher than the interest rate, although this differential has narrowed in the last few years. So given that both these factors are positive and the debt to GDP ratio has been sustainable, why should we be hung up on a deficit target of something like 3% to GDP? I think that is a basic question that the proposed commission needs to address. So that is one aspect, one reason why we are concerned about the fiscal deficit. The second is the impact of fiscal deficit on interest rates. Now there is plenty of empirical work which has happened, some of which has been cited by the last economic survey, which shows that fiscal deficits seldom have much of an impact on long-term interest rates. Long-term interest rates tend to be influenced generally by the long-term outlook for growth and inflation. So the impact of the fiscal deficit tends to be overwhelmingly on short-term interest rates, and therefore it's certainly something which should concern the RBI, which focuses on setting short-term policy rates. So there I think one of the issues that needs to be addressed is if we are going to relax the fiscal deficit target from 3% to something higher, which I think is the basic motivation underlying the setting up of this commission. If you're going to do that, then what happens to inflation targeting and the particular interest rate band in which you're operating now, which is 4 to 6%? Because you will appreciate that in the run up to the budget, there are so many analysts who are insisting that the government stick to the target of 3.5% of
that
GDP
is the IMF line, yes,
for this particular
absolutely.
year. Yeah, well, even the analysts within the country, because they're saying that otherwise there was no way the RBI was going to cut interest rates.
Yeah.
So I think those are the two reasons that we need to worry about the fiscal deficit target. I'm saying that in terms of debt sustainability, it's not clear that 3% is required at all, and there's perhaps room for a higher deficit target. We need to think about interest rates, but my prescription would be that it's not that the fiscal deficit does not need to be relaxed, but it is the inflation targeting band that perhaps need to be relaxed, and perhaps we need to revisit this whole issue of inflation targeting itself.
Absolutely. So you're moving from the area of the fiscal to the monetary. But Govind, I think TTR raised a number of very relevant points, particularly saying that when you look at the fiscal deficit or the revenue deficit, we should in fact look more at things like the debt to GDP ratio, the extent of crowding out. And he made the point that our debt to GDP ratio has not become very adverse. We haven't seen too much of crowding out. So should one look at the debt to GDP ratio, the crowding in effect, the crowding out effect, by saying the impact on interest rates, or how much of domestic savings is really left after the government borrowing? Because government as a sovereign always has the edge. We also have statutory requirements regarding investment in government securities. So corporates and the government essentially compete for the same pool of financial savings. And as you made the point, financial savings have shrunk. In 2007-8, the net financial savings available from households was about 11.6% of GDP, and the combined fiscal deficit of centre and states was only 4.1. So there's about 7.5% of GDP was left for the corporate sector, and private investment boomed at that time. Today the situation is quite different. So should we look at debt to GDP ratio, interest rate impact, rather than the fiscal deficit target, even if it is a range, Govind?
Let me put it this way. Debt to GDP, debt sustainability is an important issue, as Professor Mohan said. But one of the reasons why the debt to GDP ratio has come down is because of the inflation. If you go on inflating the economy, debt to GDP ratio, comes down. Now, I mean, that is hardly a way of reducing the, debt to GDP ratio anyway. Now, the question is, your interest payments of the union government to its tax ratio is more than 55%. Now, if 55% of the revenue goes for paying, only the tax revenue goes to, goes for paying the interest, what is left for your development? I mean, let us understand that. There are also other issues of crowding out. Now, your revenue deficit to fiscal deficit ratio, how much? I mean, 2.2, 2.3% of GDP is revenue deficit as of now. So you have a much more serious, issues of, public expenditure, allocation, and, making. I mean, why is it that we are not able to cut down our subsidies and transfers and then increase the investment? I mean, there are much more serious questions that come up. As far as the investment is concerned, see, even though these people said that they are sticking to the fiscal deficit in the last budget, there are special purpose vehicles that they have created for National Highway Authority or some other thing, and then they make large amount of investment outside the budget. And they will continue to do that. The investment will continue to happen outside the budget. Ultimately, all this has to come from the household sector's financial savings, which is 7.3% of GDP today. And our target is not 3%, our target is 5.4%. Don't exclude the states from this. And then there are public sector enterprises which ask for more money. There are much more serious issues than that. And as far as your basic idea that there is a union government which basically monitors the states, who will monitor the union government? Now, there is a very specific recommendation in the Finance Commission that you see, you need to have a fiscal council, like in the case of parliamentary budgetary officers elsewhere, Office of Budget and Accountability in UK, and then Congressional Budget Office in the United States. You need to have an independent fiscal council reporting to the parliament.
TTR, Govind talked about the interest rate payments are such a high proportion of the revenue receipts, and he argued for that is an important factor that you need to keep into consideration. But the point is, our revenue receipts, particularly tax revenue, are so low. Can we not increase the tax revenue? And if we did that, the interest payments to tax revenue ratio would improve. And in fact, that brings me to another point which the former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, had come up with. He talks about a structurally adjusted deficit target, much like the concept of a structurally adjusted growth that needs to be calculated from time to time and then monitored. So if your economy is not growing fast, your tax revenues are growing slowly, at that time your ratios might become different. So but what does a structurally adjusted target really mean? In fact, there's not even any unanimity on what constitutes a business cycle. What one makes for a recession, economists are not agreed on that. When does a recession start? So what hope can there be for acceptance of such a target? What does it really mean, structurally adjusted? Who's to define what is a structurally adjusted target? TTR?
It's not as if the compression in the fiscal deficit is what has led to higher growth. I mean, the chain of causation that conventional economists typically cite, which is that you lower the fiscal deficit and then the interest rate goes down and then investment picks up and therefore the growth picks up. I mean, this is not how growth has accelerated in India. What has happened is quite the contrary. Growth has accelerated for a number of reasons, exogenous reasons. And because the growth has accelerated, the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio has come down. And I think the important lesson that you take away from there is that you must focus on means of accelerating growth through exogenous factors such as, say, a higher level of public investment. And once you do that, the fiscal deficit automatically comes down. So this whole idea that compressing the fiscal deficit is the key to accelerating growth is something that needs to be seriously questioned. And I think the other issues that you mentioned, what would be a structurally adjusted deficit and all that are relatively secondary issues to my mind. We really need to sort of move away from this idea, which I think has been widely rejected by many economists in both the US and the Eurozone, which is that austerity is the key to greater growth.
In fact, that is why the European Union is now thinking of giving Greece time till 2040 to repay its dues, because it realized that the austerity package just didn't work. But Govind, if I can come back to the point that you made about Parliament, trying to discipline the centre. The fact is that sovereign governments are not easily disciplined by fiscal rules unless Parliament really serves as a very effective watchdog. But we've seen that our Parliament has largely failed. In fact, it's failed miserably on this role. Even when it comes to voting on the budget, many of the demands for grants are just guillotine, that is passed without any discussion. And the argument is that these have been studied by the select committees. But is that good enough? How can we get our Parliament to really keep an eagle's eye over the government?
Let me put it, let me first respond to Professor Ram Mohan. We have had a lot of experiment with the Keynesian policies in the past. And we have had it, in fact, you see, the entire 1991 crisis was an outcome of the, fast expansion that took place. Now, and that is one of the reasons why in 1996 there was this agreement that it seemed, you don't monetize the deficits. Now, the only way you can, increase the fiscal deficit and then, keep the liquidity in place is through open market operations, or to have a much more, the direct monetization of the deficit. Now, the question is, would we be willing to do the monetization of the deficit and then face the consequences because of the rigidities in the system? There are, let us understand that. You would have to look at the supply side. If of the 7.3% household sector financial sector, if the union government takes away somewhere about 6%, And then, you have the public enterprises taking away rest of it. Where is the money available for the banking system to lend to the private sector? And if the money is not there, how can you reduce the interest? Even if the Reserve Bank of India, let us say, is forced to reduce the interest rates, what happens? Then they'll crib about the liquidity in the system.
Sure.
You have faced this particular problem.
We have,
there are problems of that nature. Now, coming back to the question of fiscal council, the point is that, as I mentioned to begin with, if there is no political will, you can't, any rule or any council,
it's meaningless.
It's not going to work. But if you have a political will, you don't need all these particular things. But then in the short run, these things help. Had the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act not helped us, I think in the short run it has helped. There has been the government has to come up and say why they are doing what they are doing. There is a lot of explanation to do. And then there is a lot of restraint that they have to exercise. For the same reason, Fiscal Council will be one of those institutions. Now, hopefully over a period of time, things will have to, I know that the Parliament has not been very effective in monitoring things, but hopefully over a period of time, the very fact that they have to explain to the Parliament what they have done. There are three major tasks for the Fiscal Council. One is to, ensure that the budget, forecasts are right.
Right.
In practice, they are realistic budget forecasts.
Sure.
The second thing is to monitor the fiscal targets.
Right.
The third thing is to cost all those schemes which you come up with and from time to time and say that, smart city or OROP, you don't know what the cost is.
That's
and
true.
to tell us what
true.
is the intertemporal cost, costs of this particular thing. There's an independent commission. And on the question of how the budget deficits were brought down, fiscal deficits were brought down, let me tell you, between 2004 and 2007-8, when the fiscal deficit was sharply reduced, it was the income tax increase.
Govind, that is very true. You in fact hit the nail on the head, but I'm afraid we've completely run out of time. So we'll have to call this discussion to a close. Thank you so much, Govind and TTR, for pointing out the pitfalls that such a committee needs to watch out for. Yes, the track record of not just this government, but past governments too, in implementing the suggestions of expert committees has not been particularly good. But I guess we need to give the committee and the government the benefit of doubt. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.